Hey, Earthlings, how's you doing? I hope you're well in this strange time of ours. Now, a few people appreciated a book, a list of recommended books that I did recently, and asked for some more. And also, there's been some talk in the movement lately about the fact that vivisection seems to be a neglected issue now, which is quite interesting from my point of view. When I came into the movement, the late 70s, early 80s, vivisection was, the main campaign that was going on, whereas now tends to be kind of sidelined. So there's a lot of pressure now to start pressure campaigns again, and probably vivisection would be certainly involved in that. And so I thought I would do another list of books, or some book recommendations, I suppose. And but this time I thought I'd do it on the topic of vivisection. So here goes. I'm going to kind of do this off the cuff, so might not work, but if it does, I'll see you at the other end. So the first one is from Richard Ryder, and this is Victims of Science. Now it's interesting because Richard Ryder is probably best known in the movement for coining this word, speciesism. You can see that. And so that's quite interesting in the sense that here's an anti-vivisection book, and it starts off, the very first chapter is about speciesism. So that's really kind of interesting. And so here we start to get our first taste of an anti-vivisection kind of book. At the time, Ryder was kind of described as a psychologist in these days, whereas now he's described as a philosopher. He's got a couple of books. This is Painism, and this one as well, Painism. So he's seen as a kind of philosopher as much as a psychologist nowadays. But in these days, he's more like seen as just a kind of psychologist, if you like. So yeah. It's very, very interesting in the sense that, like I say, he starts off all this with, with a big issue about speciesism, and of course, actually, I'm going to talk at the end about human experiments. So that's one thing to come. Got my bookmark. This is not advertising. This is not advertising. So yeah, Richard Ryder there, Victims of Science. There's a couple of books here now from Robert Sharpe. This one is close to my heart in the sense that we began a campaign against Hazleton Laboratories, and it's now called Covens. And the hunt saboteurs from Sheffield in particular used to kind of go sabbing on a Saturday and then kind of raid the place, or kind of try and break into the place every Saturday. And one day we did get in, and well, several times we got in actually, and we managed to get some papers out, and so we kind of needed them to be kind of translated to a stage where we could understand it really. So this is an interesting part of that. It's not advertising. This is not advertising. So this is part of the Cruel Deception. This is called by Robert Sharpe. He was based in Sheffield at the time, and so these pages here are actually from the research that was done on paraquat for a Japanese company, and it was the LD50 test. And the interesting thing for us from the Hazleton campaign is the managing director of Hazleton in 1977 said that the LD50 was a crude measure of toxicity. He was actually saying, well, one of the main things that we do is not very good scientifically anyway. It's interesting that one of the people we got involved in the Hazleton campaign was Richard Adams, as the novelist, and he wrote the intro and forward for some of these books. And it was interesting. We took him down to Hazleton the very first time, and at the time it was just like a picket gate, just kind of like just a fence, whereas now it looks like a fortress, after all the people breaking in and all that kind of stuff. And this security guard kind of came ambling over, and just to kind of check out what we wanted, you know. And Adams wound down his window. He was in the back window, and he just went, "Tits and arseholes," to this guy, and this guy was just like totally flabbergasted. And we kind of sped off to do some media things, leaving this poor bewildered guy wondering what the heck was going on, because it was the beginning of the campaign, and I suppose they didn't really know what was to come. This one is interesting. This is another one from Robert Sharpe, and this one's after the cruel deception. And a lot of that is it goes through one by one all the kind of problems that have arisen, you know, and the cost. It's called the human cost of animal experiments. So that's the focus of this particular one. It's not so much about the actual kind of animal tests, if you like. This one is for that one. But he does say here, let's liberate science, and he's basically saying, you know, one thing you got to remember about vivisection, and about all animal use really, is that it's a big business. You know, vivisection is a big business. He says in that book, and that's one thing that we've got to kind of come to terms with, in the sense that animal advocates, we are taking on some of the biggest industries in the entire world. You know, it's one thing that is certainly a factor. Now, this is a really interesting book. This is from 1949. So I remember buying this several years before I was born, and it's George Bernard Shaw, and it's called Shaw on Vivisection. It's just it's a rundown of a few kind of articles, even speeches and stuff. And so, you know, the anti-vivisection movement has been around for you know, a good long time. There was a very kind of big anti-vivisection movement in Victorian times, and so some of this goes all the way back, you know, to the 1920s and stuff. Quite an interesting book that I picked up from, if you can see that there, Save the Children. It was in a charity shop. So the daddy of them all, possibly for a lot of people, if you think about anti-vivisection, is going to be this book. This is a book from 1979, Slaughtered Innocent by Hans Ruesch. Now, Hans Ruesch was a really interesting character. He was a professional racing driver, then he became a novelist, and then he became really well known in the anti-vivisection movement. And here we're talking about a strong scientific anti-vivisection stance you get from Ruesch. Again, in terms of celebrities, there's an endorsement there from Spike Milligan, my kind of comic hero, I suppose, at the beginning. And in fact, it's quite a powerful statement. He says, a voice for the innocent of the animal world who, in the majority of cases, are dying painful deaths for a creature called Homo sapiens, who has time and time again proved that he is not worth it. From Spike Milligan. Now, so this is a scientific anti-vivisection book, as the other ones are as well, really. And this part of Ruesch's campaign is like an attack on animal rights, really, or certainly an attack on the moral aspect of things. So it's quite interesting when you look at the kind of history of campaigning against vivisection. You know, there's a kind of moral argument, and there's been a scientific argument, and the question is whether you can blend the kind of two together. Hans Ruesch was kind of opposed to that. He kind of thought of human beings as rather selfish. He thought that you had to appeal to you know, to humans in terms of their own benefit. And again, you know, that's what's going on here. You know, the human cost of animal experiments. You know, and an animal rights stance would concentrate on the other animals, of course. So that's an interesting one. And looky here, part 2. That's called The Voiceless. It starts off with The Voiceless. So 1979, The Voiceless. I suppose nothing is new, really. This is not advertising. So, and also I wanted to point out this little bit right at the end. Yeah, this is page 430. It's a big book, this, and it's very, very heavily referenced. It's one of the things about Ruesch. It's very heavily referenced stuff. And he says, while others talked and wept, the ALF acted in an unprecedented direct action campaign. And he starts talking about what the ALF were doing against vivisection, and he's talking about 1975. And he mentions a couple of guys who got jailed for 3 years at the time, one of which is called Ronald Lee. Ronald Lee. I'm not quite sure what happened to him, but this is the kind of big daddy book of scientific anti-vivisection. But again, that warning that he's kind of opposed to animal rights, so he's opposed to the kind of moral argument. It comes out. There's a famous film called Hidden Crimes, which is still on YouTube. I think it's in about 7 or 8 parts. It's very difficult to watch, Hidden Crimes, but if you look, I think it's broken up into 7 parts. As I said, if you go to the latter part, 6 or 7, maybe 8, there's a bit where people are marching, and there's an attack on kind of animal rights. The moral argument. He's actually kind of opposed to animal rights in that sense. Also by Ruesch. This is interesting. I used to have this book, but as always, you know what it's like when you lend them out. Sometimes they don't come back. This one I lost many years ago. This one was more about the kind of the business of vivisection, whereas this was a kind of about the science or the lack of science, the fraud. Vivisection is scientific fraud in this one. This one was much more about the kind of business part of it and how it kind of links in with big business and the military and even politics. So you get this kind of scientific industrial kind of complex kind of thing. So that's an interesting. I'm not seeing this book around for years, so I don't even know if it's even available now, but I'm not quite sure. This is just a pamphlet here by Dr. Tony Page, and this is very heavily influenced by Hans Ruesch. In fact, he's kind of referencing in all the way. I like this one. I don't know if you can see that. Let's see if I can get it in the right place. There you go. Basically, kind of that thing about we've proven that this new compound, it actually says here new brew. So it's safe on rats and toads. So would you like to try some? And so it's all about that problem of species difference and the fact that even if you get good results in other animals, they don't necessarily and usually don't extrapolate to humans. What the scientific anti-vivisectionists would claim, especially Hans Ruesch, is that there's virtually no experiments that have been scientifically valid. So it should be rejected for that reason, because of the amount of damage it does to human health. Not the animal part of it. A couple of other things I just wanted to mention as a by the by, really. This is John Bryant, who sadly died recently. I must get my angles right. John Bryant. Now this is an interesting book. This is 1982. It's called Fetid Kingdoms, and this book was one of the books that got Gary Francione into the movement. So you can blame John for that if you so wish. And there is a section on laboratory animals. I'm not advertising now because I've run out of them. So there's a section on laboratory animals. And some of the famous pictures, I'm not going to show you any of those pictures of those, but there you go. He makes an interesting animal rights point right at the end. It's just a little short little section, but he says from an animal rights point of view, we've got to be careful of a nasty trap. And what he was basically getting at was that there's a kind of history that if you get some kind of famous movement against experiments, like for example the ICI smoking beagles, for example, what they'll do then is they'll transfer to a less popular animal, and he's basically saying that, from an anti-vivisection point of view, there'll be a tendency to go, oh well, we've kind of we've done some good here in the sense that we've stopped some experiments, but the chances are that those experiments will continue, but with other animals that are not as popular and won't get the kind of sympathy. And so he's basically saying, who says that a rat suffers less than a dog? And then he finishes it, he goes, oh God, hope I've not given anybody an idea for yet another animal experiment. And so that there is a bit of a kind of trap there, which John Bryant is pointing out. Now, at the beginning of his chapter on laboratory animals, he says, on the face of it, one of the most defensible areas of animal exploitation by man, 1982 product at the time, is the use of animals in research. which I thought was quite an interesting thing, because, as I said, Bryant was very influential on this guy, Gary Francione, and in this book from 2000, chapter 2 starts with a chapter. It starts with vivisection, a trickier question, and that basically is saying the same thing, that Francione's opposed to all animal use, but if there's one type of animal use which is on the face of it not trivial, or at least in some aspects of it, then it would be vivisection. Everything else could only be understood in terms of convenience or taste or pleasure, that kind of idea, whereas vivisection is a trickier thing. I often thought that was an interesting insight, and it's interesting the fact that he borrowed it, like he borrows a lot of things, especially from Tom Reagan, but he borrowed that from John Bryant. And finally, on this, this is an interesting book that a lot of anti-vivisectionists had, and it's Papworth, yeah, M.H. Papworth, and it's about experimentation on human beings. It goes into the Nazis and all the rest of it. There's another one by Lippmann, I think, on the same subject. So a lot of the anti-vivisectionists kind of had this as well, looking at that kind of connection between animal experimentation and other animal experimentation and human experimentation. Okay, so that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, really, I suppose. But I hope that's some use. I'll endeavour to put a list of the books that I've discussed, or at least shown you, in the description. So have a good day, Earthlings. Hope you're doing okay, and I'll see you again.